Hello and welcome to the latest in the BIU's series of podcast interviews throwing light on integrity issues in biathlon. I'm Callum Murray and my guest is Cornelia Blank, Professor and Deputy Head of the Institute for Sports Medicine, Alpine Medicine and Health Tourism at the private University for Health Sciences and Health Technology, UMIT Tirol, in Halle in Tirol, Austria. With a background in health sciences and psychology, Cornelia's research focuses on prevention and health promotion in and by means of sport, giving her a unique insight into the topic of this interview, athlete vulnerability. Stay tuned. So, Cornelia, welcome to this BIU podcast interview on the subject of athlete vulnerability to doping. So, I suppose the first question is, what does athlete vulnerability mean? And I know this is quite a difficult question because there's no real consensus on what is meant by that. But what does it mean to you?
Well, I'd say we have to be careful in associating it completely with doping. Like in general, by the dictionary definition, vulnerability is just a state of being exposed to a possibility of being harmed, either physically or emotionally. So there, easy said, it's a gap in our defense system. That's technically vulnerability. But in sport, it has multiple applications, some of which are general, where others are really specific to sport. For example, we have specific sport that make athletes more vulnerable to different things, not only to doping. And then we have things like age or disability that make you vulnerable to specific things in the context of sports integrity, not only in the context of doping. So it is kind of a difficult question to define it. I'd say we need a general definition that allows for conditions that are unique to different athlete groups in the context of doping. So, for example, those athletes who are tempted, those athletes who maybe lack education and are vigilant, or those who also suffer consequences from other doping. So it's different areas where we would need a vulnerability definition, but technically it's a dynamic function of risk and threat mitigated by self-protection.
So looking at athlete vulnerability in the anti-doping context, why is it so important in this context?
I'd say it is not more important in the anti-doping context than in any other context related to sports integrity. Generally, it is our task in sport to protect athletes from harm of any kind. And doping is related to harm. It harms yourself, it harms the others, and it harms the spirit of sport. So it is not more important than other aspects, but definitely it is important. And this is also reflected by the World Anti-Doping Agency definition of doping, which is not only substance abuse. It relates to 11 different anti-doping rule violations, and that reflects already the different dimension. And under the line, it's all about protecting athletes' mental and physical health and the integrity of sport. So this is why the concept of vulnerability is so important in the whole context of sports integrity. So I'd rather say in the anti-doping context, we can support the development of safe sport environment.
Are there points, do you think, in the racing and training cycle at which athletes might be particularly vulnerable?
Yeah, I think so. Given the interplay between the athlete and the environment that we all acknowledge by now, so the earlier start that we look at an athlete and say this is a bad person, that's why he or she is doping, that is kind of outdated. So we know that is a complex interplay between athletes and their environment. So this is why there are specific points they are more or less vulnerable. And these include points in specific situations or also in their personal environment, in their social environment, and also in the sport they participate in. So definitely there are different points for biathlon and racing in a training cycle. For example, if they come back from injuries, this is definitely a point where we would have to watch out if, something is with them to support them in coping with that. Or also the transition from junior to senior level. This is definitely also something you would have to watch out.
And in training, are they more vulnerable in the summer than in the winter, for example?
That really depends what's happening. Like, I don't think if you have a summer World Cup, for example, or the summer World Championship, and this is all about results, and you have a coaching climate that is results oriented, then of course they're also vulnerable in the summer. But technically vulnerability is not a trait, it's a state, and it changes in combination with what happens in your environment. So this question is difficult to answer as long as you do not know what really happens during a training cycle. But obviously, if there are special points, tipping points, you have to be on alert that they could lead to vulnerabilities with the athletes.
Can you give us some examples of difficult situations in which athletes might be especially vulnerable and how these situations should be handled?
I mean, one vulnerability is also sport specific, like especially in sports where you have a significance of biomotor qualities instead of skills and tactical skills. You are more vulnerable per sport already, because these are the sports that profit a lot from, for example, performance enhancing substances. And this in combination with the person practicing the sport adds to that, because this is mostly done by individuals who think that they have high expectations. So they are only considered valuable if they perform well in these kind of sports. So this is an example where it's a biathlon, even though, I mean, you need some skills in shooting, but you also have the cross-country skiing, which is really such a sport where you have biomotorical skills. That is a vulnerability already. And then, as I said, watch out at the environmental parts, like peer pressure, coach pressure, transition in career, sponsorship contracts, if you're right in front of getting a new sponsor or not. These are all things where we should watch out and what we can do about it. This also relates maybe to what comes later, is support the resilience, support the factors that they can, like the pro on the side of the con. Like when I said in the beginning that vulnerability is mitigated by protecting factors, we cannot take away the risk factors in professional sports. Professional athletes per se are always vulnerable because they are in that sport system. But what we can do is foster the resilience, foster how they cope with that, foster how they deal with it, and also how they give the meaning to it. Because in the end, making a decision is always related to meaning making to a specific situation you're in. So something that is a risk or a harm factor for one athlete does not have to be the same for the other, because the meaning making is different, like the meaning they assign to that situation. And this is something that we can do in all of those situations.
Are there types of athletes who are more vulnerable than others?
That's a difficult question again, because if I say yes, then it leads to we look out for these kind of types. I think it all comes together to values and moral, but that's something they bring with them. That's nothing that, that changes from one day to the other because they're professional athletes. A colleague of mine did interviews with athletes, and this is something in their upbringing, their parents, how they were raised, why they're doing their sports. So if these kind of things are strong, doing the sport because of compassion, because of performing well, but not because of winning is the only thing that counts, for example. If these kind of values are strong, then I think you might be less vulnerable to risk factors you face in a professional career. But also outside the athletes, if your coach is in an autonomous way, like includes you in the decision-making process, lets you decide things on your own, gives you responsibility, and also values that you improve in your performance, that's something that makes you less vulnerable as well. So it's not only the athletes. Like I wouldn't say there's a typical athlete. All of us and all of the athletes can become vulnerable from one day to the other because one small thing changes.
So what signs should coaches look out for to indicate that an athlete might be especially vulnerable?
I mean, coaches normally know their athletes quite well. So in terms of how they behave, in terms of how they communicate, in terms of what they try to do or what they maybe experiment in new training styles and stuff. So if things suddenly change from all of a sudden, that's a point where I'd say talk to your athlete. What is behind that change? Is it something that comes from a personal environment? Did something happen in the family? Did something happen to him as a private person or to her? Did something happen in the performance level from all of a sudden? So sudden changes, this is something I would watch out for in all different dimensions, not only in sport, but also in how the person behaves. And usually at that level, the coaches have quite a good feeling if some athletes behave normal or changed in a way of behavior. And then obviously the points that I raised before. Are you in front of a selection process, for example, to a different type of competition level? Are you transferring from junior to senior? Are you coming back from an injury? Is the outcome of one specific race really, really specifically important compared to others? These are all kind of signs where we should watch out and talk to our athletes.
And the last question, what can a coach, or not just a coach, I suppose anyone in authority in biathlon, do to increase athletes' resilience against doping?
This one is my really, really personal opinion, but I think utmost important is to create a culture which celebrates progress and not only success. This is something we all need to do, and this is not only related to coaches and federation, but also to spectators. It's not always who the winner is the best, but it's the progress that you have to observe. And especially for the coaches, it's being conscious about athletes' values and reinforcing the good ones, reinforcing fair play, reinforcing autonomy, reinforcing critical thinking. These are real important things in decision-making in general. So as I said in the very beginning, I'd rather not talk about doping prevention. I'd rather talk about personality development, because if we do a good job here, then a side effect of that will be that the athletes will be less vulnerable for doping in terms of pressure if they face these threats. Because we cannot eliminate all of those. Like, we can try. Injury prevention would be very important. Make sure that there's no overtraining. Make sure that the people have the specific strength and conditioning to, be able to do their sports. These kind of things we can also do. But the general resilience factors, to me, are much more important.
It's interesting you mention audiences. My experience of biathlon audiences is that they are incredibly supportive to athletes, and not just to the athletes of their own country, but to all athletes. I think that is our almost unique characteristic of biathlon. I don't know whether you've observed that as well.
I did, and I think this is one of the real strong protective factor for the athletes, because they feel valued for what they do. And it doesn't really matter if they have a bad day and do not perform at all, or if they're on the top of the podium. They're always cheered on by the crowd, and this for you personally, that gives you a lot in terms of self-esteem, in terms of valuing yourself as an athlete, even if you do not good on that day.
Cornelia, that's great. Thank you very much indeed for talking to us on this podcast interview.
Thank you so much.